Okay, are we just about ready to begin the Q&A? We've collected a lot of questions. Christina from Explorer has a basket. If any of you have questions that have to went with, please hand them to her. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, who am I? Who's this guy with the microphone? I'm Phil Brown. I'm the editor of the Explorer. Thank you. People really deserve the applause of the panelists here today. I thought they all did a fantastic job. And Brian as well. I'm doing Dan Stack. Did a superb job. So, well, Christina's collecting the questions. I just want to ask a few of my own. And one is to, not our panelists, but I'd like to ask Keith McKeever from the APA. It would be okay if I ask him. It seems like a lot of the problems stem from the overdevelopment on the lake shores. And this was a result of political compromises that were made in the 1970s, early 1970s, when the APA Act was drafted. And so there seems to be a consensus among everybody who looks at it that indeed we do have, that the laws do allow too much development on the lake shores. And I just wonder if the APA feels agrees with that. Do you think that the regulations as written allow too much development on the lake shores?
Thanks, Bill. Always like when you start off with me. So, that was the question I asked when I first came to the APA is why the shores classified non-intended. And I spoke time, there was quite a bit of existing development in the 60s and 70s along those shores. And that led to that classification, and also there was a smoke-filled room and all that compromise made to get the whole APA Act in. The real estate industry was working hard to get higher density along glaciers. So I certainly think history can speak for itself in regards to that action and what has happened. And I think from the ACE's perspective, that's why we fought so hard in 2008 to at least take back the regulation that allowed for expansion along the shoreline with no oversight from the APA. So,
Okay. Brian is with me here. We're going to alternate questions. And I want to start off with one for Eileen O'Connor. And this is from John Sale. And the question is, what constitutes a, and how are the septic systems inspected exactly? I mean, what do the inspectors do? And
so what the inspectors do is they go to the property and they check the plumbing to make sure that, to see if there's more than one septic system, because sometimes the kitchen waste will go elsewhere. So they verify that they know where all the waste is going. They put dye into fixtures, the appropriate fixtures. Like if there is a separate system for the kitchen waste, they make sure that they put dye into the kitchen. They add a certain amount of water that's based upon the number of bedrooms in the home. And then they go outside and survey the property really visually, and then prepare a schematic showing where everything is. Everything important, like the wells, any streams, things like that. They walk over the leach field, or where they think the leach field is, to see if they see any evidence of failure, which would be sewage on the ground surface. And so basically, that's the inspection.
This question is for Chris and Peter. If you guys could both be as brief as possible. I know it's a big question, but and I don't. There's a name on this one. There's not. So after 40 years, the APA is finally being accepted grudgingly by local leaders and at local levels. If the Act were amended to include these new regulations and restrictions that we've been talking about here today, would that reignite the animosity and anger of the 70s and 80s, potentially setting back progress and initiatives like the Common Ground Alliance?
I don't think if it is brought to people's attention, the need for the regulations is in the benefit of the landowners and the people that live and visit in the park, that it's a benefit to property owners, that it's a benefit to the economy, I think has been raised that the economy goes right along hand in hand with the environment, and we need to show them that it's a benefit, and we need to show the signs. So I think that will go a long way.
Thank you. The issue is really not in the level of development. I have no illusions that we are going to slow development on lake shores, that we're going to slow development in the park. If anything, I think historically we're going to enter into a period over the next 30, 40, 50 years of much more development than we've seen certainly in the past 30 or 40, 50 years for a variety of reasons. The issue is pollution. And we have really good track records with the Lake George Park Commission, the town of Queensbury, around Lake George, that you can make an effort. It's not perfect, and there are many of us who think it could be better. You can make an effort to control stormwater. Many argue that the efforts that have been made have actually limited the deterioration of the water quality of Lake George. It would have been much more pronounced, much sharper, were it not for the efforts to try to control stormwater that are on the books. So, by focusing on pollution as opposed to the nitty-gritty of density, I think there's a real opportunity. Lake George communities, a number of those are growing and are some of the more dynamic in the park. So I think the proof's in the pudding.
Okay, this is a question for Julie. You mentioned in your presentation that fine particles were the biggest culprit in the pollution of Lake Tahoe. Could you explain a little bit about what those fine particles are, and where they come from, and how they can be controlled?
Thank you. Fine particles. It's basically runoff. It's organic matter. It's the dirt in our driveways that runs off in the driveway into the road, which then is conveyed to the lake through some kind of tributary. And it's the same concept that we've been talking about with stormwater. And the water hits the roads act as a conveyor belt, taking them right into the lake. So the fine particles, that was just new emerging science that we took many years to sort out. We still have an emphasis on algal production and algae and the algae on the rocks, the periphyton, but it's the fine particles that have really highlighted the need for roadway improvements. So, I ran out of time, but our capital investment program has really shifted the focus of our agency from strictly a regulatory agency to one that is coordinating this $1.7 billion restoration program. And we've probably spent $500 million in the last 15 years on roadway improvements. We have snow issues like the Adirondacks. We have salt and sand that's applied to the roadways. So we've been working with our highway departments, Caltrans, NDOT, to not just be careful with how much they put on the roads, and they actually have temperatures in the highways that indicate when it's necessary, so there's not over salting and over sanding that happens. We also have invested in high efficiency sweepers, Vector. It's almost like vacuum trucks that go once the snow melts. These are deployed out on the roadways, on local neighborhood streets, and on state highways to actually vacuum up those fine particles. It's just dust. It just blows up in the air. It becomes airborne, or it gets into the runoff. And so we then also on the roadways, we install infiltration treatment or underground sand separators, so that when the actual runoff makes its way into the lake, it's cleaner than when it first started. So that's just a little bit of a picture of that.
So this is for Eileen. And the question is a political one. How did Cuyahoga County get this inspection program approved in the first place, especially if you have powerful interests, real estate groups, that kind of organization? How did you get it passed?
We had to close bathing beaches due to high coliform counts, and it was very upsetting to many people that had the bathing beach be closed. And so that gave the elected officials the political will to push this through.
This is a question from Dan Plumley from Adirondack Wild. He asks, early APA leaders sought to explore cumulative impact assessment as a needed tool in shoreline and water quality protection. Do the panelists feel that this is still important? Where and how is this done effectively? Lake Tahoe, for example. So, who would like to tackle that question first? Peter?
It clearly still remains an issue for the APA. The APA has tried sporadically to come up with a series of indicators by which they'd be able to evaluate the impacts of the Act over time. They've made some efforts to try and disassemble what that list of indicators would be, but there's never been any real effort, largely for staffing. There's never been any real effort to try and actually go out and research those indicators and then try and come up with some type of comprehensive assessment to evaluate the impacts of land use across the park. Clearly that would be beneficial to development projects. It would be useful in looking at the impacts of the single house or the subdivision of any size, to be able to look at cumulative impacts. It hasn't been done, and it's developing that list and those indicators into a comprehensive program would be very useful.
And I can just add to that, to speak from Lake Tahoe's perspective. We have a pretty elaborate scenic chapter within our regional plan, within our code of ordinances, and we were set up initially to evaluate properties a certain distance from the lake. So we have a whole body of research that people have actually gone out and taken surveys every 4 to 5 years. We have a mandate to report every 5 years how are we doing on those things called environmental threshold standards. And scenic is one of 9 categories that I flash on the screen. So we evaluate scenic. We actually have a very detailed scoring system. Private properties on the lakefront, private properties visible from scenic highways, which are essentially all the main highways around the lake. And then we have an elaborate system when projects come forward to comply, and we have a numeric system. So if a property is being built on the lake, there's a score that has to be hit. It can be, there's flexibility to improve the score. You can have low impact or a low reflective glass, which helps screen. The more native vegetation to screen the property from the lakeshore is another way. And then that's just part of our structure. But it takes resources to do that. It's a very resource-intensive endeavor, and our scenic program, like every other program that we have, money is tight. So what we've tried to do to be creative to keep that sort of analysis going are the new projects that are large, which have environmental requirements for environmental documentation. We have very elaborate environmental impact statements that get done on large projects. So we use those opportunities where private project applicants can assist the data set in their applications. So it's in their interest as they come in the door to do a project to help us with our data that will in turn help the whole region as a whole evaluate the scenic resources over time.
Hold on to the microphone for a second. I'm going to ask you one more question from the list, but I also want to shout out one other quick question. One of the themes that we've heard here today, and that I think Randall Aaron will talk about more in a little bit, is that the park agency rules were approved through great controversy and compromise 40 years ago, and it's been politically difficult to update those over time. It sounds to me like your organization has been able to find enough political consensus to adopt new ideas like the ones you just described. How, with 2 states involved, a representative from the President of the United States, I mean, how do you get to the place where you can add modern regulatory ideas? How does that get approved?
It's not easy. It's not. I am by nature a very enthusiastic person, so if I'm painting a prettier picture than reality, I do apologize. It is not easy. Well, our compact just was amended, and the last update was in 1980. Our regional plan was adopted in 87. We just updated that regional plan last December, so 25 years. Now, we've done updates and amendments over time, but not wholesale comprehensive change. So the wholesale comprehensive change to update our regional plan took elevating all the way to the governor's offices of the 2 states, our Senate delegation. You know, we're very fortunate we have the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Harry Reid, is our Nevada senator. So we had a lot of political weight to bear in that process. But what I have found in working for the TRPA for 10 years is to look for solutions that don't require that, going to that level of changing legislation. Changing legislation today is not easy. I mean, we can't pass the farm bill. We can't pass a lot of things in America right now that used to be easy to do. So where we can, I think as organizations, find other solutions that don't require going all the way to a state constitution or to some elaborate legislative process, then that's all the better. But there are times when that's impossible. So it's just a matter of getting the community involved. I think that was our answer to coming to consensus around our long-range plan update. The community had felt very disempowered over time. They felt like this regional entity is in place. The board is not locally elected for those seats. Some of them are local elected officials, but they're not elected to our board. We got the community involved. So we ended up getting, about 5,000 people in a very small area engaged in that planning update over time. We had workshops, we had visioning sessions, and then that spoke to the political process. And when the elected officials see that many people engaged and that a common vision was emerging, there's always disagreements. There's plenty of disagreements about approach and policy, but a common vision did emerge. That helped us move the needle to get over the finish line.
I would add this one thing briefly. The TRPA environmental assessments that were mentioned are on the TRPA website. They're actually pretty good. They're not perfect, but they're an attempt to look at a broad spectrum of assessments to try and evaluate the job that they're doing to protect the resource. Compare that to an APA annual report. The APA annual report is largely pretty pictures of staff and commissioners. Very little data, very little assessment of any kind. So it's a very different approach as we see.
This is a question for Peter and or Chris. It has to do with the land transfer development rights that was mentioned earlier. The question is, and what this would do, it would transfer building rights from a rural area, such as resource management lands or rural use lands, to more developed lands, such as that are classified as moderate intensity or hamlet or lower intensity. The question is, how would transferring these building rights improve water quality or just the quality of the environment in general? And also, this is something that the APA is behind. There is some legislation in the state legislature. So I don't know if either of you can answer this question, maybe somebody from the APA could. But where does this legislation stand and what's holding it up?
Regarding the transfer of development rights, I feel that this also goes along with consideration of an incentive program where if we know how to do development better, we know how to implement low-impact development. And I think that if we can incorporate, and as Peter said, we're not against development, we're against pollution. So if the proper measures are put in, if we stay away from the resource areas we want to protect, the steep slopes, the buffers, if we implement low-impact development to capture our stormwater and put in measures that integrate each other and preserve the important areas such as the native vegetation, then I think there can be consideration for incentives. Maybe there is increased density permitted if the proper development is considered. So I think that we need to not just say no, but we need to be creative and figure out ways that we can protect these important resources. And as people want to develop, that if they do it right, then they should also receive some benefit for that also.
Thank you briefly. The agency's act, the agency's legislation on TDRs is basically going nowhere. The Senate may pass it. It's dead on arrival as it currently exists in the state assembly for a variety of really good reasons. TDRs as a concept are not a bad one. I think a lot of people would agree we should be able to take transfer density out of areas that we think would have a negative impact away from sensitive resources and put it in areas where it's more concentrated. Not a lot of folks are going to argue that. With the APA's particular approach here, there was zero analysis that was done. There was a little Q&A sheet on the website, which was led a lot to be desired. There was no analysis, for instance, on just give us one town of how it would work. Where would the development rights come from? Where would they go? There was no analysis about what happens in towns that have multiple school districts. A number of Adirondack towns have multiple school districts. Can you take value from one school district and transfer it to another? There are a lot of technical issues that the bill sort of glossed over in its current composition. But the big thing is just show us the need for it and how it would work. The areas that they were anticipating take development rights from resource management and transfer them down into rural use and low intensity. Rural use and low intensity have been the APA land use classifications that have been the fastest growing since the Park Agency Act came into existence. In many areas, they're growing faster than Hamlet and moderate intensity areas. But with the absence of real analysis as to how this bill would work and what the practical application is for how this would play out, I don't see that bill advancing in the Assembly at all, because I see them as wanting real details and analysis.
This question goes back to the septic project, Eileen. As you guys go through your review and you're talking to landowners, are you promoting any alternatives to traditional septic systems? And if so, what are them?
No, not really. The septic systems that are allowed are specified by New York State under their regulation called Appendix 75A. And if the system is installed according to those regulations, which we make sure that they are, for conventional systems, and they do have alternative systems that they do allow, they should really function properly and prevent pollution. So outside of what's in that document, Appendix 75A, we don't allow other types of systems in our county. And some of the things that they do have are like sand filters that discharge to an absorption field. They've got mound systems, they've got fill systems. So what's already out there and regulated are alternative systems, I guess, but they are accepted and they function properly. Was that your question, you said?
This is another one for Chris and or Peter. The question is, what percentage of subdivisions approved by the APA in the last 10 years were examples of conservation design? And what percentage were typical mindless grids?
I cannot talk park-wide. I can talk around Lake George. We attend all planning boards around the watershed, and to my recollection, there has been one subdivision in the last 10 years that could be considered a conservation. They called it, we didn't really view it as a conservation, so one in the last 10 years.
In Keith's presentation, which was very good, he held up two models of where the agency used conservation subdivision, the project in Horicon and the project in Keene. I was scrolling through my mind, that's where they applied conservation subdivision, and then I was thinking of all the permits where they ignored conservation subdivision. Stickney Point, Woodhall Lake, Front Street, the ACR project in Tupper Lake, the list goes on. So the agency, in my experience watching the agency, if they have an applicant that is open to these ideas, they may be able to get a fairly good project through. If they have an applicant that is not open to good ideas, such was the case. We went through months and months of negotiations on the ACR project. It was the applicant's way or the highway. The applicant is not open to conservation subdivision. The agency has nothing really to compel them to do it, and they end up approving piano key lots along the lakeshore or fairly poorly constructed projects like that.
Tom, just handed to Julie a question going back to you. And you may have covered some of this in your presentation, but let me elaborate on this a little bit. Remind me, your organization, how many staff members do you have?
Sure. We have 68 staff members
68 for an area how large?
for 500 square miles, very much smaller.
And compare that to the park agency. What's your staff level now? 53. So you're smaller staff for an area how large? 9,000 square miles. And what's your budget?
Our budget is 80 million, and about 4 million of that is highway transportation money from the federal government that's dispersed to local governments.
So say the number again.
18 million total.
And what's roughly the APA's budget? Do you mind answering that? 4 million. So yours is, for an area much smaller, yours is more than 4 times larger.
Yes.
Okay, now I'll come to this actual question.
Let's just get that straight, right?
Yeah, right. You're taking us all to dinner after this.
Right.
And I missed part of your presentation, but the questioner is under the idea that you have a $1.8 billion fund for capital reinvestment. Yes?
It's not a fund, it's a program where we raise funds, basically.
And
Yes.
from where?
Yes. Federal, state, local, private.
Okay, and so talk a little bit more. So all of those different sources, and you're guaranteed to have roughly that much to spend over what period of time?
Sure. So what happened in '97 when the slide I showed that had President Clinton and Vice President Gore on the lakeshore, we got everyone's attention. We entered a real new era of collaboration at that point. We recognized at that time, from doing those environmental assessments every 5 years, we would never reach our environmental goals with regulations alone. It was clear because we don't allow that much new building. We let out about 130 building permits for single-family homes each year in the whole Lake Tahoe Basin. So the amount of new development, because we cap numbers of homes, we cap numbers of hotels, that's a different model. So we did not have enough new development where people are building smart to fix the problems of legacy impacts from the 60s and 70s. So this was a new idea to have this capital investment strategy, which was always in our regional plan, but we never had any money for it. So we got the President of the United States to come to Tahoe. He signed an executive order. We then got the Lake Tahoe Restoration Act passed, and I'm actually going to Washington next week to pass the reauthorization of the Lake Tahoe Restoration Act. So we've had about $500 million from the federal government, $600 million from the state of California, $100 million from Nevada, about $50 million from the locals, and about $300 million private dollars, where people doing their own erosion control, people thinning the forests on their properties, Heavenly Ski Resort putting in a $12 million gondola to take cars off the road and move people around better to reduce pollution. So all of that adds up to the $1.7 billion, but it's not something that we have guaranteed funding. We go out and compete for grants and for other.
About how much gets spent every year, ballpark?
So it depends. For a while, we were very fortunate. We, with Senator Reed's help, the state of Nevada has 85% public land, more public land in the state than any state in the nation. So they were able to sell some federal lands in Las Vegas, urban lots in Las Vegas, and channel those monies to do environmental improvements both in Las Vegas and then Lake Tahoe, about $35 to $40 million a year for the capital investment. And none of that comes to our agency. And so just to clarify the $18 million, so you don't think we're just sitting fat and rich over there, probably 15 to 20 of our 68 staff members are 100% grant funded. And that comes from that blend of state and federal grant money on stormwater management, on Clean Water Act 319 money. I mean, those monies are out there, and that has supported that program for many years. But all that's drying up. So we really have about 3 years left of money to do those kind of big capital infrastructure projects. And so we are shifting to a completely different model of more private sector, more public-private partnerships, because we've actually been shrinking our staff accordingly, because we just don't have that in perpetuity. It's just not there. So we are changing that model, but it did give us that momentum that we needed to stabilize the clarity loss, and we think that the investments that we've made are paying off.
Thank you for that. One more question?
Okay, I guess we only have time for one more question. This one is from Mike Bailey. He's concerned about salt. He says he contacted the state legislators and asked them what can be done to control it, and he was told that there really isn't much of an alternative to salt. So I'm wondering if anybody on the panel thinks there is an alternative, and what it might be.
Well, salt is going to become a much bigger issue than I think we can all realize. It changes the ecology of our water bodies, and we're seeing that change in Lake George. There are alternatives. For years they were applying sand, and then water bodies became impaired. Lake George is an impaired water body due to sediment, so they stepped away from sand and went to salt-only policies. Around Lake George, they started applying what is called magic salt, which uses byproducts from fermenting and actually mixes with salt. You still use salt, you use a much less percentage of it in your mix. And it adheres to the road better, works at a lower temperature, and although it costs more, the savings winds up becoming in labor, that you don't need to send your road crews out 2 times during a snow event. You may only send them out once, so you spend more upfront on materials, but you reduce your labor costs on sending drivers out during the storm. So that is one alternative that is being applied at several towns around Lake George.
But that would be creating a phosphorus problem.
It was both good answers. Do either of you have anything to add? Okay, that's it for the question and answer. And now we'll make a break for lunch and be back here